The Tonight Show, NBC Studios, Burbank, November 1972. I worked sound for the couch segment for 4 years, and I saw things happen on that stage that the broadcast didn't always capture, and that memory doesn't always preserve accurately over 50 years. But some nights cut through all of that and stay sharp and specific, regardless of how much time passes, the way certain images stay crisp while everything around them blurs. That Tuesday in November is one of those nights. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was 6 feet from the couch, I had a clear sightline, and I was paying close attention to the wrong thing at first. I was watching Johnny. I should have been watching the other guest, but I'll get to that. The booking had come from Fred de Cordova, the way most interesting bookings came from Fred, through a series of phone calls that started in one direction and ended somewhere else entirely. He had been reading about kung fu tournament circuits, about the competitive side of Chinese martial arts that existed outside films and outside demonstrations, the real competitive infrastructure that most Western audiences didn't know existed. He made calls and eventually reached a contact at a martial arts organization in San Francisco who gave him a name. The name was Wei Tu. He was 33 years old, born in Guangzhou, raised in Hong Kong, training in Wing Chun and various northern Chinese styles since he was 6 years old. He had emigrated to the United States 8 years earlier and had built a school in San Francisco's Chinatown that the competitive martial arts community in California knew well. That year, he had won a significant open tournament that drew practitioners from across the West Coast, the kind of event that serious people in the community took seriously. He had been profiled in a martial arts magazine that Fred had read on a flight, and Fred had decided this was interesting television. He was not wrong. Wei Zhang was genuinely impressive. His technique was real. His credentials were legitimate, and he spoke excellent English, which simplified the logistics considerably. Fred had met him once before the taping and described him to the floor director as sharp as a blade and about as easy to redirect. That description turned out to be accurate in a way Fred hadn't fully understood when he made it. The second guest for the segment was Bruce Lee. Fred had been trying to get Bruce back for months. Bruce had agreed with the same condition he always attached to Tonight Show appearances. He wanted to come out as a surprise, no advance announcement. He said it produced better television. Fred agreed. Everyone who needed to know knew. Everyone else didn't. Wei Zhang did not know. That was going to matter. Bruce arrived at the studio around 6:15. I was near the stage door when he came in. Dark jacket, plain shirt, nothing that identified him as anything in particular to someone who didn't already know. He shook hands with the stage manager, found the green room, got tea from the craft table. I walked past the green room once while he was waiting. He was sitting with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes open, and the quality of stillness he had was not performed stillness. It was the real kind, the kind that comes from being genuinely settled rather than from deciding to appear settled. Wei Zhang arrived about 40 minutes later. His entrance was different. He arrived with the specific energy of someone who had prepared for something and was ready to deliver it, which is a legitimate quality and not a criticism. He was dressed carefully, moved with the particular precision of someone who was always aware of how they were carrying themselves, and he went into his green room and stayed there. I found out later he had been told the segment would include a comparison between Chinese martial arts and other combat disciplines. He had prepared talking points. He had thought about how to represent what he did and what he knew in the context of American television. He had come ready to explain things. He had not come ready for Bruce Lee. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue was good that night. I remember that much. First guest was someone promoting a film. Then the second segment, which was Wei. He came out, and the audience gave him warm applause. He was visually interesting, moved well, had the kind of compact physical authority that read clearly on camera. He sat on the couch, and Johnny opened with the standard questions. What is Wing Chun? How does it differ from other kung fu styles? How long have you been training? Wei answered all of it fluently and well, with the confidence of someone who had given versions of these answers before and had refined them into something both accurate and accessible. Then Johnny asked him about Bruce Lee. This was in the notes. Fred had included it specifically, knowing Bruce was coming, wanting to set up the contrast before the reveal. Johnny said, "There's been a lot of public attention lately on kung fu, as a result of some very successful films. Would you say those films represent real martial arts accurately?" Wei looked at Johnny, and something in his expression shifted slightly. The way expressions shift when a question has touched something the person actually has feelings about, rather than just talking points. He said, "The films are very successful, very entertaining, and I have tremendous respect for what Bruce Lee has accomplished in terms of bringing attention to Chinese martial arts in America." He paused. "But," Johnny said. "There it is." Wei said, "But films are films. What you see on screen is choreography." It is beautiful choreography, very skilled, but it is designed to be filmed. It is designed to look a certain way to a camera. That is a different skill from actual martial arts. Johnny said, "So you draw a distinction?" Wei said, "A significant one. I have trained in Kung Fu for 27 years. What I know is not what you see in films. What I know is built from 27 years of daily practice, of real contact, of understanding the principles underneath the techniques, rather than the techniques themselves. When I watch those films, I see performance. Beautiful, skilled performance. But I see performance." Johnny nodded. He said, "And if you were to compare your understanding of Kung Fu to what's being shown in those films," Wei said, and this is the sentence that changed the temperature of the evening, "I would say, I know that art better than the people being paid to perform it." The audience made the particular sound of a group of people who have just heard something pointed and are uncertain whether to laugh or hold still. Johnny leaned forward slightly. He said, "That's a strong statement." Wei said, "It is an accurate statement. I am not criticizing anyone personally. I am saying that being able to perform martial arts convincingly for a camera requires specific skills that have little overlap with actually understanding martial arts deeply. These are different things. Subscribe right now, because in about 90 seconds, the person Wei Zhong was talking about is going to walk through that curtain, and what happens next is the reason this video has the title it has. Johnny said, "Well, I happen to have someone backstage who might have a perspective on that distinction." He looked at camera 1. "Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Lee." The curtain opened. The audience response was the wave. It always was, with Bruce on this show, a sound that started at the back and moved forward as recognition traveled from person to person, building as it went until the whole studio was in it. Bruce crossed the stage and took the second guest chair, the one adjacent to the couch. He nodded at Johnny. He looked at Wei Zhong and gave him a small, easy nod, the nod of someone acknowledging another person without loading the acknowledgement with anything additional. Wei looked at him. I was watching Wei's face when he understood who had just sat down next to him. The recognition happened in layers. First, the face registered as familiar. Then the context resolved. Then something more complicated moved through his expression. Not quite embarrassment, not quite recalculation. Something that contained elements of both, without fully committing to either. He had just said, on live television, that he knew Bruce Lee's art better than the people being paid to perform it. And the most famous of those people had just sat down 12 inches away. Johnny, with the timing of someone who has been doing this for 11 years, let 2 full seconds of silence land before he said, "Bruce, you heard what our guest was saying." Bruce said, "I heard." Johnny said, "Thoughts?" Bruce said, "He's raising a real question. The relationship between filmed martial arts and actual martial arts is worth discussing honestly." Wei said, "I appreciate that." Bruce said, "But I'd separate 2 things. The question of whether film can fully capture what real training produces, that's worth asking. The question of whether the people doing the filming have real training, that's a different question." Wei said, "A fair distinction." Bruce said, "Do you believe the distinction applies in this case? To me specifically?" Wei looked at him. Something in his expression settled into a position. He said, "I believe that you are an exceptional performer. I believe your physical skills are real. I believe you have trained seriously." He paused. "And I believe that the understanding I have developed across 27 years of dedicated study goes deeper than what film requires a practitioner to develop." "Yes." The audience made a sound. Bruce said, "What would that deeper understanding look like?" Wei said, "It would look like knowing the principles behind the techniques, rather than the techniques themselves. Knowing why something works, not just that it works when performed correctly under controlled conditions." Bruce said, "And you believe you have that and I don't." Wei said, "I believe I have developed it to a level that commercial film work doesn't require, and therefore doesn't tend to produce." Bruce said, "What principles specifically?" Wei said, "The centerline principle. The concept of simultaneous attack and defense. The economy of motion that comes from understanding structure rather than memorizing sequences." He paused. "I have spent 27 years on these things." Bruce said, "So have I." Wei said, "In Wing Chun specifically?" Bruce said, "I started with Wing Chun. I've been building beyond it for 15 years. Wei said, "Into what?" Bruce said, "Something I call Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, which is less about intercepting fists and more about meeting things at their origin before they become the problem they were going to become." Wei was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know the name. I have read about the concept." He paused again. "With respect, a concept that exists primarily in interviews and in the theoretical writing of someone who spends most of their professional time on film sets is a different thing from a system built across decades of real engagement with real opponents. The audience made a larger sound than before, like this video right now. Not for any reason, except that what Bruce says next is something I have repeated word for word in every telling of this story for 50 years. Bruce looked at Wei for a moment with the patient, complete attention that was his most consistent quality in any room. He said, "Show me what I'm missing." The studio went very quiet. Wei said, "I beg your pardon." Bruce said, "You've described something I have that doesn't go deep enough, and something you have that goes deeper. I'd rather experience the difference than discuss it. Show me what I'm missing." Wei looked at Johnny. Johnny looked at his floor director with the expression of a man who knows something is developing and hasn't decided yet whether to interrupt it or let it happen. Wei said, "This is a television program." Bruce said, "It is, and it has an audience, which means if you show me something true, several million people will see something true. That seems more valuable than describing it." Wei said, "You're suggesting a demonstration." Bruce said, "I'm suggesting you show me what 27 years of deeper understanding looks like when it meets 20 years of what you consider performance. Right here." The studio audience produced a sound that started at the front rows and built. Wei was quiet for a long moment. He was calculating something. I could see the calculation happening, and what he was calculating was more complicated than a simple yes or no. He was calculating what it meant to decline in public, what it meant to accept in public, what the various outcomes of each looked like, and which of them served what he actually believed about himself and his training. He said, "All right." Johnny said, very carefully, "Let's keep this as a demonstration." "We're not." Wei was already standing. Fred de Cordova, watching from his position near the cameras, said something quietly to the floor director that I couldn't hear from my position, but that I could read in the floor director's expression, which was the expression of someone who has been told something and disagrees with it but is going to do it anyway. The cameras stayed on. Bruce stood. He did it without urgency, without any performance of readiness, the way he stood up from chairs generally, which was with a quality of economy that made the standing look like the continuation of whatever he had already been doing, rather than a transition into something new. They faced each other in the space between the guest chairs and the desk. Wei was perhaps 2 inches taller, slightly heavier. He moved into a stance that was recognizable to anyone who knew Wing Chun, the classic centerline guard, weight distributed, hands at the correct heights, everything technically precise. Bruce stood the way he stood. Wei said, "I'll show you the simultaneous attack and defense. I'll come at you slowly, and I'd like you to respond however you respond." Bruce said, "Go ahead." Wei moved. He moved at demonstration speed, controlled, a right-hand strike along the center line, the basic Wing Chun straight punch, delivered with the structure of someone who had thrown it correctly 10,000 times. Bruce's left hand came up and deflected the punch offline by exactly the amount required, no more, while his right hand simultaneously came forward along the same center line Wei had just vacated with a counter that stopped 2 inches from Wei's sternum. Both hands moved at the same time. The deflection and the counter were one motion, not two. Wei looked at Bruce's right hand 2 inches from his chest. He said, "That's the simultaneous attack and defense." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "That's Wing Chun." Bruce said, "That's where it started." Wei stepped back and reset. He tried again, this time with a different entry, testing whether the first response was pattern recognition or genuine reading. He came with his left hand this time, feinting slightly before the real technique. Bruce read the feint without reacting to it and responded to the actual technique, his deflection meeting Wei's hand at the precise moment and position where deflection was most efficient, and his counter arrived at Wei's shoulder. Wei stepped back again. His expression had shifted from the settled certainty of before into something more active, something working. He said, "You're reading before I commit." Bruce said, "Your left shoulder moves a quarter second before your left hand. It's a small tell. I've seen it twice." Wei's left shoulder moved involuntarily as he processed this, the unconscious checking of a description against the body's own memory. He said, "I've trained for 27 years. Bruce said, "The tell is that deep. That's not a criticism. It's just information." Wei was quiet for a moment. The studio was very quiet too. Then he did something that changed what the evening was going to be. He stopped demonstrating and started fighting. Not violently, not with the intention of causing harm, but he stopped performing at demonstration speed and started moving at something much closer to the speed at which things actually happened when he was serious, and the audience felt the change, even if they couldn't have named what they were feeling. He came forward with a chain of techniques, the combinations he had built across 2.5 decades, each one connected to the next, the kind of thing that became instinctive through repetition until the sequence was no longer composed of individual techniques, but was a single, flowing thing. Bruce moved through it. Not around it, through it, inside the combinations rather than outside them, finding the spaces between the techniques, the half-second gaps where one motion ended and the next hadn't quite begun, and in those gaps, touching Wei at positions that communicated clearly where the touch could have been something else. He touched Wei's wrist as a punch extended. He touched Wei's elbow as a follow-up began. He touched the back of Wei's shoulder as a combination completed. Touches, not strikes. Each one light and specific, and held for a moment before releasing. Each one saying the same thing without words. Wei stopped. He was breathing harder than a few seconds of exchange should have produced, the elevated breathing of someone who has been working at full attention rather than full exertion. He stood and looked at Bruce. He said, "You're inside the techniques." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "You're responding to the initiation rather than the technique itself." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "The shoulder." Bruce said, "And the hip before the shoulder." The sequence starts earlier than most people look for it. Wei absorbed this. He tried once more, and this time the approach was different, because he was trying to eliminate the tells he had been told about, to initiate without the shoulder drop, to move from somewhere less readable. He was partially successful. The shoulder was smaller. Bruce noticed this and acknowledged it with a brief nod. He still read it. His hand found Wei's wrist as the technique arrived, a redirection so precise that Wei's own committed momentum carried him half a step past his intended position. As Wei adjusted, Bruce stepped to the inside of his recovery, too close for Wei's techniques to function in the geometry they needed. And from that inside position, his right palm rested against Wei's chest. Open hand, 2 fingers, the specific placement that communicated exactly what was available from this position. Wei stood with Bruce's palm on his chest and looked at him. The studio was the quietest it had been all evening. Bruce lowered his hand and stepped back to neutral. Subscribe if you're watching this. The next 30 seconds on that stage are the reason NBC almost cut the entire segment from broadcast. Wei stood in the space between the chairs and the desk, and his expression was doing several things simultaneously. The professional certainty that had characterized everything, from his entry to his talking points to his challenge, had been replaced by something more complicated and more genuine. The specific expression of someone who has just received information that restructures something they believed was already structured correctly. He was not angry. That's the first thing I always say when I tell this story, because people expect anger, and it wasn't there. He was processing, genuinely processing, which is a different thing entirely, and more interesting. Then he said something that nobody expected, least of all Johnny. He said, "Do that again." Not as a challenge, as a request. The request of someone who has just seen something they need to see again, to understand it properly. Bruce looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. They went again. This time, Bruce moved more slowly, walking Wei through what he was doing, and why, showing the sequence from the outside, rather than applying it from the inside. He showed Wei where, in Wei's own initiation, the information appeared. The hip loading before the shoulder moving before the hand, the sequence that gave away the technique's direction before the technique had fully committed to its direction. Wei stood and received this with the focused attention of a serious student, which is what he was underneath everything else, which is what 27 years of genuine practice produces, regardless of what else it produces alongside it. He said, "The hip loads first." Bruce said, "Before the shoulder." Wei said, "I've never been told that." Bruce said, "Most people watch the hand. By the time the hand is moving, the information is already older than it needs to be." Wei said, "You watch the hip." Bruce said, "I watch what comes before the hip, the weight shift that loads the hip. That's the earliest readable signal." Wei was quiet. He tried his own technique slowly, feeling the sequence from the inside, locating the moment Bruce was describing. He found it. He said, "That's deep." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "That would take months to change." Bruce said, "Longer. It's in the foundation. You can reduce it. You can't eliminate it quickly." Wei looked at him. He said, "You knew this before I finished my first technique." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "How?" Bruce said, "I've been reading initiation for a long time. What you just showed me in your chain combination, I had the whole picture after the first 2 techniques. The rest was confirmation." Wei was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the floor briefly, and then back at Bruce. He said, "I said something before you came out." Bruce said, "I know." Wei said, "On live television." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "I said I know your art better than you." Bruce said, "Yes." The studio was absolutely silent. Wei looked at the audience. at the 400 people who had been through this evening with him and who were watching him now with the specific focused attention of people who understand that something significant is about to be said. He said, clearly, directly, without any performance around it, I was wrong. He said, I have trained seriously for 27 years, and I am confident in what I have built. I stand by that confidence. But I said something specific about a specific person without the information to support it. I said I know his art better than he does. I was wrong about that. I am saying so in front of everyone here because I said the wrong thing in front of everyone here. The audience began to applaud. It started in the front rows and built into the room the way genuine response builds, from the people closest to the thing outward to the people further back, and by the time it was full, it had the quality of something honest rather than something polite. Johnny let it go for several seconds before leaning toward his microphone. He said, I have been doing this show for 11 years. He paused. That is the most useful thing I have ever watched happen on this couch. More applause. Johnny looked at Bruce. He said, do you want to say something? Bruce said, what he did just now is harder than what we just did physically. Anyone who's trained seriously knows how hard it is to say that out loud. I have respect for it. More applause. Different in character from the first, warmer and more specific. Johnny looked at Wei. He said, what do you take from tonight? Wei thought about this honestly, the way he had thought about everything, without rushing toward an answer. He said, I take away that I confuse depth of training with breadth of understanding. I have gone very deep into specific things. He has gone deep into different things and has also built across a wider range. I treated my depth as if it mapped onto all possible directions. It doesn't. He paused. That is a useful thing to know. Johnny said, Bruce? Bruce said, I take away that his techniques have a foundation I hadn't fully appreciated before tonight. The chain combination has a structural integrity that comes from 27 years of real work. The tell is in it, but the structure is real. I'll be thinking about what his approach does, that mine doesn't for a while. Wei looked at him. You're telling me you learned something? Bruce said, I learned several things. Wei said, from me. Bruce said, from tonight. Yes. Wei was quiet for a moment, then he said something that I remember exactly, because I have thought about it many times across many years. He said, that is either very gracious or very true. Bruce said, both, ideally. The audience responded, and the response was the warmest of the evening. Fred de Cordova, watching from near camera 3, said something to the floor director that I was close enough to hear. He said, don't cut any of this. The floor director said, we may not have a choice. Fred said, I know, but don't cut any of it. During the commercial break that followed, a senior producer came onto the floor. I was breaking down equipment near the desk, and I heard the conversation because I was close, and it wasn't quiet. The producer said, the physical exchange could not air on the West Coast feed. He said Standards was going to have serious questions about an unscripted physical exchange between two guests on live television, regardless of what it looked like from the floor. Fred said it was a demonstration. It was exactly what the segment was about. The producer said she stepped toward him and threw a real technique. That's not choreography. Fred said nobody was hurt. The producer said that's not the relevant question. Fred said, what is the relevant question? The producer said, the relevant question is what NBC's liability looks like when a guest initiates a physical exchange with another guest and it airs nationally. Fred was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the East Coast already saw it. The producer said, 12 million people saw it live. The West Coast feed we can cut. Fred said, you'll cut the best 11 minutes of television this show has produced this year. The producer said, I'll cut the part where things went off the rails. Fred said, nothing went off the rails. Look at the audience. Look at what happened. Nothing went off the rails. The producer said, I'll look at it with Standards in the morning. He walked away. The West Coast feed cut from Wei, saying prove it, to a transition, and then commercial. The full exchange, the techniques, the conversation after, Wei's public correction, all of it removed. The East Coast had seen it live. About 12 million people. The switchboard lit up during the break. Not complaints. People asking what they had seen, asking if it was real, asking when they could see it again. The tape was pulled from standard archive access within 2 weeks. The official note on the episode log listed the reason as production discretion, which is the language used when someone made a decision and didn't want to spend more words on it. I kept my audio reel. Not the video, the audio. I have it still. My wife listened to it once and said it was strange to hear something significant with no image, that it sounded like a conversation, which it mostly was. The physical part, The techniques, the touches, the hip loading information, all of that was a few seconds. The conversation around it was much longer, and it is the conversation that I think about when I think about that evening. What happened in the corridor outside the green rooms after the taping is the part I tell less often but remember more clearly. I was in the corridor breaking down my equipment when both of them came out at roughly the same time, from different green rooms. Bruce, with his jacket over one arm, Wei, with his training bag. They saw each other in the corridor. The fluorescent lights, the empty hallway, the sound of the building at night. No cameras, no audience, no Johnny, no translator. Wei said, "The hip loading. Before the shoulder. I've been thinking about it for the last 20 minutes. Bruce said, "I could see you thinking about it on the couch." Wei said, "It's deep." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "It's in the structure of how I initiate everything." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "Which means every technique I have is communicating before it arrives." Bruce said, "To someone who knows where to look." Wei said, "To you." Bruce said, "To anyone who has built that attention." Wei was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many people have built that attention?" Bruce said, "Not many." Wei said, "So in most contexts, the tell is functionally invisible." Bruce said, "In most contexts, yes." Wei said, "Which means my training is effective in most contexts." Bruce said, "Your training is exceptional in most contexts. What I showed you tonight is the exception, not the rule." Wei said, "But it exists." Bruce said, "It exists." Wei looked at him. He said, "I came on this program tonight to explain Chinese martial arts to an American audience that doesn't understand it. That was my goal." Bruce said, "You did that." Wei said, "And then I said something else." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "I said it because I believed it. I want to be clear about that. I'm not embarrassed that I believed it. I had reasons for believing it." Bruce said, "I know." Wei said, "The reasons were incomplete." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "The public correction was uncomfortable." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "It was also necessary." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei was quiet for a moment in the fluorescent corridor. Then he said something I have thought about many times across 50 years. He said, "What I said on the program tonight, in my correction, about going deep in specific things, while you went deep in different things and broader. Is that an accurate description?" Bruce said, "I think so." Wei said, "My depth is real." Bruce said, "I know. I felt it. The chain combination has a structural coherence that comes from a long time of serious work. The foundation is real." Wei said, "But the breadth is missing." Bruce said, "Everyone's breadth is missing in some direction. That's what other practitioners are for." Wei said, "To show you the direction." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "By being the opponent who comes from that direction." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei said, "Which is what happened tonight." Bruce said, "Yes." Wei extended his hand. Bruce shook it. Wei's grip was substantial. Bruce's grip was what Bruce's grip was, built from a different kind of conditioning, something Wei registered in his expression. Wei said, "Come to my school in San Francisco. I want to show you something about the structural chain work, not to prove anything. I think you'd find it interesting." Bruce said, "I would." "When?" Wei said, "I'm there Tuesday and Thursday mornings." Bruce said, "I'll find a Tuesday." They separated in the corridor. Bruce walked out first. Wei followed a few minutes later. I stood in the empty hallway for a while after both of them were gone. I was 28 years old, and I had been working at The Tonight Show for 14 months, and I had thought I understood what made evenings interesting and what made them ordinary. That evening updated my model significantly. What made it interesting was not the techniques. The techniques were extraordinary, but techniques on their own are just techniques. What made it interesting was the conversation that happened around the techniques, the specific honesty of it, two people working out something true in public without deciding in advance what the truth was going to be. Wei had come in certain. He had built certainty across 27 years of daily work, and he had brought that certainty onto a television stage and had been shown, clearly and specifically, where the certainty needed updating. And he had updated it in public, without softening it, without framing it as anything other than what it was. That is harder than most things that happen on television. It is harder than most things that happen in life. The hip-loading tell is smaller now, if the people who trained with Wei in the years after that evening are to be believed. They described a period in his training where he was working on something specific that made his initiation temporarily slower and less powerful, which is what addressing a deep structural issue costs in the short term before it pays in the long term. And then they described the result, which was that his entries became harder to read in a specific way, that none of them could fully name, but that they could feel when they worked against him. He did the work. That's the complete accounting. He went on television and said something that turned out to be wrong, and said so out loud, and then went back to his school and did the months of difficult work that the correction required. The audio reel is still in a box. The audio has the conversation on the couch, and the applause and Johnny's voice. If you listen past all of that, you can hear something in the 5 seconds before Johnny goes to commercial. A very small sound, the specific sound of air displaced by a technique, completing its arc through the space where a person was and then wasn't. That sound is what 11 minutes of live television that NBC decided shouldn't be broadcast comes down to. 5 seconds of audio from a Tuesday night in Burbank. I was 6 feet away. I heard it clearly, and I have been waiting for 50 years for the right place to say that I heard it.